Hey guys, hey, we're gonna stay 6 feet apart. Heidi and I are gonna stay 6 feet apart, so I'm gonna take my mask off so you can hear me. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, they're nodding,
Okay,
yes.
nodding heads, great. So my name's John May. I'm the Executive Director of the Sandusky Area Maritime Association, which is the parent organization that runs this museum. And what we're gonna do today is take a quick walk through the museum. I'm not gonna show you everything because we really don't have enough time. And I want you to come visit us in person as soon as you can, okay? So the first thing I'd like to talk to you about is the Maritime Museum of Sandusky. It's all about celebrating the maritime history of our area around Sandusky. Now, it's not just Sandusky itself. So if we look back here on this map, here's the little town of Sandusky. And the area that we're talking about in terms of the history we're going to study and celebrate and preserve here goes all the way out here to about Oak Harbor out on the Portage River, up around the lakes. We'll even cross the border into Canada if we have to, and then coming back south over here to the little town of Vermilion. So it's this whole area we're talking about, the shores and islands here that are around Sandusky. Now, Sandusky, last year we celebrated our bicentennial, which means Sandusky is 200 years old. So it's been around for a long time, and we've got a lot of history to celebrate. This particular ship's wheel, we keep this here as a reminder when you come in. This is a great place to have your picture taken. This is from the Chippewa, which is one of the steamers that used to go between Sandusky and Detroit, Sandusky and the island, Sandusky and Cleveland, even all the way up to Buffalo at the other end of the lake. I'll show you a model of the Chippewa later. But this is one of the artifacts. So a museum, you know, a museum, we collect a lot of stuff. We collect stuff that represents our history, and then we try and display that stuff in such a way that it helps people understand the history that we're talking about. Okay, so come on with me, and I'll show you one of the first things we like to talk about when folks come to visit the museum. I'll just sort of let you maneuver around to where you can get to the best place you can. And we're gonna look behind me. Heidi will move the camera around a little bit for you to hopefully show you that there's a building inside a building. Now, if you look at that building, you should notice something kind of special about it. Up on the very top where the seagulls are sitting, you might not be able to see it, but there's a light up there. This is actually the lighthouse that's out on Cedar Point. You might not have known there was a lighthouse out on Cedar Point because it's overshadowed by the roller coasters. But the lighthouse that's out there has been there for over 100 years. So in 1862, they built this lighthouse, and this is actually a half-size exact replica of the Cedar Point Lighthouse. So the Cedar Point Lighthouse is still out there. If you go out to Cedar Point to Camper Village, you can see this building, and it looks just like this. And in our museum, it houses our theater. So follow me again. We're not going to see the movie today, but we're going to talk a little bit about it.
Scary room.
Scary room. It's the blue room. It's like you're underwater. So again, we're inside a replica of the Cedar Point Lighthouse, and so I always take some time to talk about Cedar Point here. Cedar Point is celebrating its sesquicentennial, which is 150 years old. Bicentennial, I mentioned, that's 200 years. But 150 years old, this year is celebrating Cedar Point. Now, it's not much of a celebration because of the pandemic, but the reason we come in here is because it lets us celebrate the guy that actually started Cedar Point as we know it today. His name was George Beckling, and he was a businessman from Indiana. And George Beckling had visited other waterfront resorts in the country, and he thought Cedar Point would be a great place to create a resort where people get away from the heat of the city or from their everyday lives and go for a little vacation. I don't think George Beckling probably figured that it was going to be as big as it ever got, but George had his own ideas of how to make it big. And so he bought the land and he put some things out there that would attract people. You know, it was like there were little horsey rides, there were some boat rides. But the only way to get there was a long, dusty road that went all the way the length of the Cedar Point Peninsula, which now is the Cedar Point Chaussee. There's some houses out there. Pardon me, that's me. Shut that down, it's spammy. My friend, potential spam. So it was a hard way to get there, and George Beckling thought, boy, if I could only find a way to get people there faster. And he did. Of course, he bought and built a boat, which he named after himself, as guys with a lot of money usually do. So he named the boat the G.A. Beckling, and the Beckling was christened. They hit it with a bottle of champagne in 1907, and actually here's a picture of it in 1909, I'm sorry, 1909. And it operated from 1909 until 1952. And I'll let you guys do the math, what that is. I'm not going to do it in my head. And every summer, the Beckling went back and forth between Sandusky and Cedar Point. And what was kind of neat about the Beckling, this is a model of the Beckling, is that it had a pilot house on each end. So the boat never had to turn around. It would just go straight to Cedar Point. They would reverse the paddle wheels, which were on the side, and it would paddle its way back over to Sandusky, and then it would paddle back and forth all day long, and it could carry 2,000 people, which at the time was a lot of people to be taken to Cedar Point. And it was awesome. And in the end, they didn't stop using it because it didn't work anymore. They stopped using it because it got kind of expensive to run, because they needed to have more specialized guys to take care of the steam engine. So they sold the boat, they sold the Beckling, and it became a floating warehouse up in Wisconsin. Kind of a bummer end for the Beckling. She was a grand old lady and had done a lot of work. And it was kind of a drag to have her up there as a warehouse. So in the 80s, a group was formed here in Sandusky called the Friends of the Beckling. And the Friends of the Beckling had this great idea of bringing the Beckling back to Sandusky and restoring it to put it into service as an excursion boat, kind of like the Good Time is. You know, go out at night for a sunset cruise. And it was a great idea. And the truth was, it was easy for them to raise money, because if you grew up in Sandusky at that time of your life, you loved the Beckling. You went on field trips on the Beckling. You might have had your first date on the Beckling. You might have gotten engaged on the Beckling. You know, the Beckling was awesome. And they had no trouble collecting money. And they collected a lot of money. And they brought the Beckling back. It was a big day in the bay. All kinds of boats that were out there to meet it. And for a long time, it sat tied up down at the Jackson Street Pier, which has just been restored beautifully. And that's where they were doing the restoration. You could go down there and see the guys working on it, and it was awesome. And then they took the boat to Toledo to have some new engines put in it, because they weren't going to run steam engines. And while it was in Toledo, you can't see the picture, but you'll come in and see it sometime. Some vandals lit the boat on fire, and it was destroyed. And the dream of restoring the Beckling came to a crashing end. But the good news is, at the same time the Beckling was destroyed, the Sandusky Area Maritime Association was being formed, and they were able to transfer all of their treasure, not only their monetary treasure, but all of the artifacts that they had taken off the Beckling. They were able to transfer that to the Sandusky Area Maritime Association, and our museum is now the largest holder of Beckling memorabilia and artifacts off the Beckling. So it's really neat to see. We'll see another model of the Beckling when we go outside. So when you come in, you get to watch a little video. It tells you all about the history of the area, but I'm a lot better than the video. So stick with me, and you can come and see the video another day.
Just wanted to give them a little peek of the
Oh,
model.
yeah. Well, there's another one. It's got better light on it over here. Here's another model. We have no shortage of Beckling models, but here's another model of the Beckling. So I talked about how the Sandusky Area Maritime Association was formed when the Beckling was destroyed. The Maritime Association has actually been around since our 26th year. And at the time when we started, we didn't have a museum, but we had an idea for a museum. And we know what were the stories that we were going to tell. And there were about 6 topics that people came up with. Well, we want to talk about shipbuilding, and we want to talk about the Beckling and the other steamers. Like I mentioned, the Chippewa, remember the big ship's wheels off the Chippewa. We want to talk about the golden age of steamships. We want to talk about some of the industries that really drove Sandusky to be a growing city, and commercial fishing. And one of the things that we'll see when we go around the back wall here, which is kind of funny for us today because no one ever think about it as a business, but it was ice harvesting. Sandusky was one of the largest ports in the world that harvested ice out of the bay. So And that ice was shipped from here to New York City and as far west as St. Louis, and even down, they had a contract down to Havana, Cuba. So you could be sitting in a lot of places around the world drinking cold drinks, alcoholic and soda on Sandusky ice. It was pretty exciting. But we'll talk more about that when we get behind the wall.
We'll need that ice now.
We do need that ice now.
No, I wouldn't eat that ice now.
So one of the things you learn about when you come into the museum is the arrival of steamships on the Great Lakes. Now, we don't even think about it now, but in 1818, the same year that Sandusky was founded, I might add, a ship called the Walk in the Water was the first steamship on the Great Lakes. It was built down near Buffalo in a town called Black Rock, and it used to stop here in Sandusky all the time. Now, at the time, you can see that the model of the Walk in the Water, it has side wheels on it, but it also has sails on it. You know, this whole steam thing and steamships, that was a new technology. I mean, it would be the equivalent of us trying to go to Mars. You know, it was a little bit, magical. So just by the fact that they had sails on it, you could tell it's like, wow, that steam stuff, that's all right, but I want sails on my boat. Just make sure I have some sails in case the steam doesn't work. And the truth was, there were a lot of accidents in the early days, over 200 steamship accidents that, killed almost 2,000 people in those early days. So it was a little bit tough to take a steamship, but it didn't stop people. And you may have heard about, the Great Migration west along the Oregon Trail, people going on prairie schooners. Well, for us, these steamboats that started to go on the lakes, they were like the prairie schooners, and they helped thousands of people come from the East Coast up into the Midwest and the Great Lakes region. In 1825, a canal was completed from the Hudson River, down near New York City, all the way to Buffalo. It was called the Erie Canal. It was named after Lake Erie. And when that canal was built, people could take a boat all the way from the East Coast of New York City to Buffalo. And then once they hit the lakes, they could go everywhere. That caused the cities and towns along the lake to explode in population. Most of those towns quadrupled in size. So 4 times their size between 1825 when the canal was completed and 1850. It was just a massive amount of people that came into the Great Lakes region, and it helped Sandusky grow, and other cities that the names of, like Cleveland and Toledo and Detroit and Milwaukee, all the way through the lakes. Because the truth is, once you get onto Lake Erie, Lake Huron, and Lake Michigan, three of our Great Lakes, are all at the same elevation. So we could go down here in Sandusky Bay and get in a boat, and if you're strong rowers, we could row to Chicago. Takes a long time, but you could get there. You could get there by boat. Now, getting from Lake Ontario up to Lake Erie is challenging because of a great thing called the Niagara Falls, but there was a canal built to take care of that. The Welland Ship Canal connects Lake Erie to Lake Ontario, and then going from Lake Huron into Lake Superior, you have to go through another set of locks at the Sault at Sault Ste. Marie. But now all the lakes are connected. And it really made a huge difference for the commerce and for the people coming up into the lakes. So follow me, Heidi, if you will. We're going to go around the corner. If you live in Sandusky, if you live around here, you know that we hear a lot about the quality of our water, and we have these algae blooms in this time of year where the lake starts to turn green and get a little funky, and nobody wants to go swimming in it, and actually shouldn't because it's kind of dangerous. But one of the reasons that our lake has gotten that happening is because the diminishment of our wetlands. Now, wetlands are an area near the edge of a large body of water. And this light represents the wetlands that used to exist and now have pretty much vanished. Wetlands are important because they act as a filter to filter out certain things that are not healthy for the lake. And one of the things that's really not healthy for the lake is fertilizer that farmers use on their field, because that fertilizer, as much as it makes the corn and soybeans grow, it also makes the algae in the lake grow pretty dramatically. And it's a problem, and it's that the loss of our wetlands, that filter has been problematic. So there's a lot of work going on to restore the wetlands. You'll read more about that when you come to visit the museum. I mentioned shipbuilding is something that we wanted to talk about when we established the museum. And I'm not talking about just like little boats that we go out and water ski on and go fishing on. There really was a huge shipbuilding industry here in Sandusky. This particular exhibit allows youngsters that come in to spend some time in the boat yard, and they can make a little ship and think about the days when here in Sandusky, ships of 100, 200 feet were being built right over here on our waterfront at Monk Shipyard was the nearest, and they would launch those into Sandusky Bay, out into the Lake Erie, and they could go to points beyond. I mentioned the ice harvesting, and that's what this is. This exhibit here that Heidi's going to shoot a picture of, and you can see our big horse. Ice harvesting took a lot of guys to do this work, and they weren't paid very much. But when the ice got thick enough for them, which was about 12 inches thick, 8 to 12 inches, they get out there and start cutting ice. And the ice was first scored by a team. A horse carrying a sort of a big giant rake that would score the ice out in 2x4 blocks. Then fellows would go out with saws, they'd cut through the ice and they'd cut a canal, and they would send the ice down the canals towards the shore. At one time in Sandusky, there were over 50 ice houses along our waterfront. And the ice would come in and they'd store it in those ice houses, which had double thick walls. They had an outer wall, and then a space, and then an inner wall, and the space they would fill with sawdust that was an insulation. And ice that they put in those ice houses could last for 3 years. But that wasn't the first destination for the ice. The ice, they put them in the ice houses sort of to store them, but the first place the ice would go was into railroad cars to go off to those places I mentioned, St. Louis, New York, and so on and so forth. There were at the busiest times of ice harvesting, let's call it 1885, 1890, over 500 railroad cars per day would leave Sandusky filled with ice. Can you imagine that? Now, we don't even think about it. We go to the refrigerator and put our cup under the ice dispenser and ice cubes fall out. But back in the day, come on over here for a second, Heidi. Back in the day, before we had refrigerators and freezers, your great-grandma would put this in her window. She'd put this little red card in her window, 25, 50, 75, or 100, and it would tell the iceman, who was a guy that drove a wagon full of blocks of ice around town, it would tell them how big a block of ice they needed to put in their ice box. So this is an ice box. This is your great-great-grandparents' refrigerator. It was just a wooden box. It was insulated, probably with sawdust in its double walls. And they'd put that big block of ice in there, and it would last for 2-3 days, and they could keep their food cold. And this is how our great-grandparents would tell the iceman how much they needed. They'd put this in the window, and they would decide how much ice he was going to drop off for them. You know, that's all changed. You know, there's a lot of things that have changed through the years. You know, we don't have an iceman. We don't have a coal man that brings our coal around. But in this particular ice harvesting, it was a huge industry here in Sandusky, and it employed thousands of men during the winter months. And those guys that worked the ice fields in the winter, in the summer, what do you think they did? They were fishermen. Now, those two businesses went together hand in glove. You needed 10 pounds of ice to preserve 1 pound of fish. So they would have ice harvesting jobs in the winter, fishing jobs in the summertime. And there's other businesses that people don't even think about that were involved in this anymore. I mean, this industry is almost gone, but fish were kept in these barrels made by guys called coopers. That's a person that makes a barrel is called a cooper. So just think of the industries that were involved in this. There were lumber yards. There were guys harvesting trees and lumber yards, cutting the lumber to make barrels. There were coopers putting together the barrels. There were ironsmiths putting together the hoops. The fish would go in, 1 pound of fish, 10 pounds of ice, and away they would go. So fishing, commercial fishing was a big part of our industry here. I want to talk briefly, when we get back over here in this area, this is one of our newest exhibits, and it's about the Underground Railroad. I hope that you learned about the Underground Railroad in school, but you remember sort of a dark part of American history When we had slaves here in the United States, the first slaves arrived in the United States in the early 1600s, around 1619 or so, in a town called Jamestown, Virginia. And those slaves spread throughout the entire United States. Now, there were slaves in the South, we hear about a lot, working the plantations, but there were slaves here in the North too. Really, from agriculture to industry, there were slaves at work. Now, eventually, most of the slaves were working down south in the southern part of the United States, which is what led to the Civil War. And at the time, the only real freedom that slaves could find here in North America was across the border in Canada. Slavery was abolished in Canada earlier, much earlier than it was in the United States in the 18th century. So slaves needed to get to Canada to truly be free. Even getting across into the northern states, and your geography doesn't, it's not important here, but Ohio is a northern state. We know we're a northern state, but our states just south of the Ohio border, which don't seem that far south, like Kentucky and West Virginia, those were slave states. So really escaping, if I could just get across the Ohio River, I'd be free in Ohio. Except that's not what the laws were. Slaves could escape into Ohio, but their owners in the southern states could come into the free states, and if they could find them, they could capture them and take them back. And they would send slave catchers up here. So the only way a slave could truly seek his freedom at that time was to get to Canada. Now, why is that important to us? Because just, right across the street here is the bay, which gets you out of the lake, and just out there in the middle of the lake is Canada. So Sandusky was a great demarcation point, a place where people get into boats and go to Canada. And most of the slaves would strive to get aboard a steamship because the steamships would go from Sandusky, I mentioned the Walk in the Water and the Chippewa, they would go to Sandusky to Detroit, but you have to go up the Detroit River to get to Detroit. So as you're going up that river, on the west side of the Detroit River is the U.S. and slavery, or not safety from the slave catchers. But on the right side of the river is Canada and freedom. So there were some sympathetic steamship captains that may have been friends with abolitionists or were paid well. And they would make a little detour and get over to the Canadian side and put those slaves in the water in a small boat. There'd be some boats there to pick them up, and they would put them off the boat, and that would allow them to get to freedom. Some slaves, because they couldn't get aboard a steamship because the slave catchers might have been watching, they opted to get a sailboat to take a boat from Sandusky, from someplace on the southern side of the lake to the northern side of the lake. And so our exhibit actually shows a mid-19th century boat called a Sharpie. Sharpies were used in the fishing industry. And Heidi, if you can put the camera down here on this picture, and I'm not sure if it'll come through, but this is an example of a Great Lakes Sharpie that was used in the fishing industry. You can see that it has a foremast and an aftermast. And that's what we built our boat modeled after. You can see it here. And there's a very famous book that was written about the Underground Railroad. It's called Uncle Tom's Cabin. It was written by a woman named Harriet Beecher Stowe. And Harriet Beecher Stowe was not from around here. She lived in Massachusetts, but she had a cousin who lived here. His name was Lucas Beecher. He was a lawyer in downtown Sandusky. And in Harriet Beecher Stowe's book, Sandusky plays prominently in certain chapters of the book. And one of the stories that she tells is about a woman named Liza who was to escape to Canada disguised as a man with her son who was dressed as a little girl. So our exhibit depicts Liza, that character, and her small child trying to get across the lake. There were a few sea captains here, fishing captains, that had boats that were well-known abolitionists, people that wanted to get rid of slavery. And they would take it was a pretty rough trip to get across Lake Erie from Sandusky, but the islands provide some sheltered water, shelter from the winds. But this exhibit really tells the story of the Underground Railroad and the development of here in Sandusky. We'll stop here briefly just because this is one of the stories that we tell in the museum. It's about the Battle of Lake Erie, which happened in the War of 1812. The War of 1812 is one of those things that gets skipped over in history class a lot because it's sort of pinched between the Revolution, 1776, George Washington and Alexander Hamilton, and the Civil War with General Robert E. Lee and Ulysses S. Grant. People forget about this war that happened in 1812, and it's almost a war worth forgetting. It was an unfortunate war because none of the things that the United States hoped to accomplish during the war really came to pass. So when they teach the War of 1812 in England, they kind of say they think they won it, we think we won it. It's hard. It's kind of a tough thing to talk about, and it's legitimate. They actually captured and burned Washington D.C., the capital of the United States. So by the European standards, they're like, hey, the way war works over here in Europe, if we capture your capital city and burn it down, that means we win. But America was young and not, we didn't believe that. So you couldn't break the American spirit. So there's a lot of question about the War of 1812, but there's one thing that's certain. The Battle of Lake Erie, which was fought between two men, really. Robert Barclay was the commander of the British fleet, and a gentleman named Oliver Hazard Perry was the commander of the U.S. fleet. And it's the only time in the history of United States naval warfare that the United States captured an entire enemy fleet. And Commodore Perry was able to do that. He sent a famous message at the time that said, we have met the enemy and they are ours. And then he named off how many, 2 brigs, 3 sloops, and he named off the 7 ships that he had captured. It's a great story to find out about. It's a great story to hear about because America was not doing terribly well in the battle, and then something happened, which I'll save as a mystery for you. And the battle had raged on for about 6 hours with no one really having a great advantage, but America was not winning. And then because of this thing that happened in 15 minutes, Perry managed to win the battle and have the entire British fleet surrender to him. So when you come in to see that, I'll give you a hint. It has to do with the famous battle flag, don't give up the ship. And the irony of that is the only way that Perry managed to win the fight is that he did give up the ship. So I'll save the story for you. Come in sometime and we'll talk more about the Battle of 1812, which is something I'm very, very interested in. This is an exhibit about Johnson's Island. Johnson's Island is the only island that's inside of Sandusky Bay. People know about Kelly's Island and South Bass, where Put-in Bay is. Those are all out in the lake. They're close by, but Johnson's Island is entirely inside Sandusky Bay, and it's famous now because it's a great place to have a vacation home or a full-time home over there. But during the Civil War, that war between the states, Johnson's Island was actually a prison camp for Confederate soldiers. So soldiers that were fighting down in the southern states during the Confederate War against the war between the states, they would be captured in a battle and they would be transported up here to Sandusky by train, and then they would get on a boat and go over to Johnson's Island. I don't know if you can see this right here, but here's Sandusky, here's Cedar Point, there's Marblehead over here, and then Johnson's Island is that little island there that's actually inside the bay. There's not much to see over there now, but there is a small cemetery and a monument to the Confederate soldiers there. So this exhibit was new 2 years ago. I'm not sure if you guys have ever get out to the west end of Sandusky, but at the west end, it's on our western skyline, you can't miss it, is the coal dock, number 3, where coal is loaded into freighters and taken all over the world. In Sandusky, at one time there were 3 of these things. Remember, what these things do is pick up a coal car full of coal, dump it upside down, and then the coal goes down into the belly of the freighter. There were only 2 of these of this model ever built. One was here in Sandusky, one was in Norfolk, Virginia, and that one's been torn down. So this is the only one still operational. It was built between 1937 and 1939. We have a great photo essay on the back wall that shows the building of that particular loader. And last last year was its 90th birthday. It's been in operation continuously for 80th birthday. And it still operates. This is actually a functional model. We can run cars up here. It's broken right now, but by the time you come in, it'll be fixed. This is a great video that was made by BCSN of operations out of the coal dock. The superintendent of the dock is telling the story of the dock and how it works. And what's amazing about that operation is really, it hasn't changed that much since 1939. And it's something to see. If we have time, we should go out and look at the boathouse. Thank you for joining us.